And I think the impact of AI on media tech and media startups really can't be overstated. I think to really answer this question, it's helpful to provide a bit of structure. So one way that we like to think about kind of our landscape and to map the impact of AI and of innovation on our landscape is by thinking of the kind of media tech value chain, or rather the media value chain. And so that is how content is created, distributed, consumed, and monetized. And then kind of looking into each of these quadrants individually to kind of look a bit deeper for the impact of AI.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to and watching another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today is a really special episode for me. I'm interviewing an old friend and someone I founded a company with a long time ago. I'm speaking with Denise Xifara, who is partner at Mercuri VC. Denise, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's really nice to be on.
Yeah, this is also a special episode in the sense that you are the first VC who's coming on the show. But I thought, given our long history together and your role investing in AI startups in the media space, this could be a really interesting one. Before we get into some of the things that you're seeing in the investment world, I'd love to hear just kind of what inspired you to join Mercuri and also found Venture ESG.
Absolutely. Well, as you know, Ben, the backbone of my career has really been a passion for technology and the consequential impact that it has on businesses, but also society and the environment. And so really that's what's inspired my work with both Mercuri and Venture ESG. So Mercuri is a pre-seed and seed venture capital fund in London. Our mission is to invest in truly transformative deep tech and media tech businesses, which are really at the forefront of digital experiences, but also of enterprise. And it's extremely rewarding because I have the opportunity to work with truly talented, visionary founders who are just so very creative about what's possible and what they can do with technology. And then Venture ESG is sort of very complementary to that because it's about engaging with these transformative technologies, but not just in terms of for the benefit, I guess, rather with a mission of achieving significant growth and commercial success, but doing that in a very responsible way. So it's looking to establish ESG in early stage venture, especially around responsible technology, which is very relevant to early stage venture. And I think that in order to achieve that commercial success that we want startups to achieve, in order to do that, actually, it's very important to have also been very mindful about responsibility and safe AI and privacy and sort of all of the other ESG considerations as well. So both are really in tandem and both are about putting technology to good use and achieving great things in the right way.
Yeah, I love that. It's no surprise to me that you're doing those types of things because that was always a big focus for you.
Yeah.
Even, when we met at Oxford. Has your vision changed at Mercuri or since founding Venture ESG in terms of what you're seeing in the market or what you're hoping to get from those funds?
The vision hasn't changed. From the beginning, I guess it was about cool tech. As I said, it was about working with amazing people and supporting them and kind of building a partnership and again, having that element of responsibility. I guess what has been different, or rather what's been unexpected, is the element of kind of still doing some startup work internally as a fund as well. So we hadn't expected, the vision sounds great, what I've just described, but running a fund is essentially like running your own company. We have to do our own fundraising. We have to do our own admin. There's sort of, that kind of background work that you don't really think about. And it ends up being, actually pretty time consuming and a big part of the job too. And in fact, we probably have more empathy with founders than people might expect. So there's obviously that side to the job as well, which is what's, really going on behind the scenes that you don't necessarily expect when you're saying, right, I'm going to invest in great technologies and cool people.
Yeah, I love that insight because it's true. That's not always what you think about when you think about VCs investing in the space.
Yeah,
I might have touched on this a little bit, but what are some of the most unexpected challenges that you've faced as a VC?
Definitely the fundraising. I have to say, I don't think it's controversial to say this, but I think it's probably easier fundraising for a company than it is fundraising for a fund. It's a kind of massive endeavor that you're doing in the background, or rather in parallel to the investment work. It's a full-time job in its own right. You have to tell your own story. You have to craft your own narrative. You have to do a lot of engagement with investors, a different type of investor, not a VC fund, but a different type of investor. And it's honestly quite humbling as well. And it keeps you on your toes, and it keeps you very honest. And, again, it definitely creates a lot of empathy. And I feel a lot of sympathy for the founders that speak to us. I think it might be helpful to them to know that we basically go through the same challenge on our side too.
Yeah, that is nice to hear for founders, I think, who are usually very deep in the trenches and feeling alone at those moments. Shifting a bit more away from the fund experience and towards the market more generally, how do you think AI is transforming media startups in particular, since that's one of your core kind of industries at Mercury?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge question, actually, and I think the impact of AI on media tech and media startups really can't be overstated. I think to really answer this question, it's helpful to provide a bit of structure. So, one way that we like to think about kind of our landscape and to map the impact of AI and of innovation on our landscape is by thinking of the kind of media tech value chain, or rather the media value chain. And so that is how content is created, distributed, consumed, and monetized. And then kind of looking into each of these quadrants individually to kind of look a bit deeper for the impact of AI. So I'll do that. And so starting first with content creation, in and of itself a massive space. If I had to split it up, I'd split it into kind of two core groups. The first is the content generation itself. So looking at the content itself. And obviously you can't not talk about generative AI. So synthetic content generation using artificial intelligence. I mean, obviously this is completely redefining this entire industry. There's arguably no limit to the scale of what content can be generated today. We can start to think about endless media. We can start to think about infinitely personalizable experiences. But even without going so far into the future as relates to endless media, and we think about, in the short term, the impact of generative AI, I mean, it's impacting the entire creation process, whether it's accelerating ideation, whether it's the editing of content, whether it's the adaptation of content so that you can distribute it across different platforms, reformatting, switching. What I mean by that is switching, say, from text to video to image, and adapting the content so that it caters to a particular environment. Today there are co-pilots available that can help creators, I guess, with all of those different functions. To give you some examples, in fact, this is a space we've been heavily investing in. To give you some examples from our portfolio, just to bring this to life a little bit, Scroll AI is an investment that we made, which is a co-pilot for journalists. And so that's helping with pulling content together, thinking about tagging sources, thinking about summarization, and just kind of really helping journalists with their day-to-day job. A very different company that we invested in is called Unikin. And so that's a co-pilot for game developers. And so that's actually helping with the code writing and code editing on top of the Unity platform. And so that was just the content sort of itself in terms of the creation process. Another kind of massive space within this quadrant is ways of working. So you think of tools like Figma, right, or other collaboration tools. They're using AI to streamline work processes for creators. And in fact, it's not even just about collaboration. There's also knowledge sharing tools. There's work management tools. And again, maybe just to bring that space to life with an investment, we have a company in our portfolio called Pendulum, and they're a visual first sort of context aware search tool that helps creators really leverage institutional knowledge that exists within organizations. So that is typically a lot of knowledge that was sort of hard to access or untapped before. And that's just the creation part. So if we look at the sort of next quadrant, which is distribution, again, we can distinguish between the actual distribution of content and then all of the factors, I guess, around content distribution. So, looking at the direct distribution itself. So, for instance, obviously, again, with generative AI, and it's hard to avoid talking about generative AI, but if we think of chatbots as becoming this sort of kind of mainstream approach for disseminating information, inevitably that means we have to reimagine all concepts related to SEO, all concepts related to content bundling or unbundling or recommender systems. So it's really changing what we even mean when we say content distribution or content discovery, again, flipping that on its head. And then looking at the sort of tools around distribution, again, they're very heavily impacted by AI. Think of content moderation and how that works and what you need for content moderation. Think about privacy tech, whether it's AI enabled or about privacy preserving within an AI environment, and even content analytics. So the types of content analytics that you can do, again, are the new opportunities in the space too, bringing it to life with some companies. Electric Twin is a synthetic data generation company, so it simulates human behavior. It does market research by looking at synthetic humans effectively. Very different type of company is Ergodic, which is all about causal inference and explainable AI, which is actually, I think, a really exciting space and a very necessary space, in light of AI innovation. Third quadrant is consumption. So that's very much about looking at the user perspective. So how AI is influencing consumer experience and user experience. And again, that could be an individual, but it also could an employee or someone within an enterprise setting. And obviously AI is really accelerating immersive experiences and accelerating, or rather reshaping digital experiences. And it's not just the experiences that are changing, it's also user expectations. They're evolving, of course, because of AI. I think, again, for instance, about personalization and what our expectations are of how apps, what features they have and how they function and how they enable us. And the final quadrant is actually one that's probably not necessarily the most impacted, but certainly extremely significant, which is monetization, which is looking at the business models of media businesses or media tech products. And they're continuing to evolve. I mean, these were already being heavily disrupted from kind of the advent of social media, especially for traditional media businesses. And now, that kind of really strong disruption, I think, is continuing. So whether it's advertising and marketing, whether it's the subscription economy, which is, of course, evolving because of AI products, or whether it is licensing of content. And again, generative AI in particular is impacting this. Content licensing, as I'm sure you know, is in fact potentially quite controversial. How we think about content ownership or how we think about our ability to use content and train algorithms. All of that's under a lot of scrutiny. And again, that's also leading to very interesting innovation. So for instance, we have a company called Human Native in our portfolio that's essentially a content marketplace. So it helps AI developers license content directly from the rights owners. This is a type of product that until a few years ago, pre-generative AI would, have been unimaginable in a sense. So these are just some of the ways, but, thinking of, I guess, the four quadrants and going back to your question, I mean, it's an overhaul of the media industry. I think the impact of AI, whether because of AI products or because of how AI is influencing products, is truly enormous.
I love that framework in terms of really breaking down from, creation, distribution, consumption, and monetization. I have to ask, given how transformative that feels across every part of that value chain, do you feel this is more disruptive a shift almost than what happened with social and digital in the first place? Is it just as big? Is it bigger? Is it smaller?
I think it could be bigger, actually, Ben, because what happened with social media, I mean, that had a big impact on the business models of media companies in terms of a disruptive impact and sort of really challenging how they monetize and how they think about content ownership. But for many other types of players, actually, social media was a massive opportunity. So think about marketing, customer acquisition, advertising. It was not so much about closing doors as much as opening doors and actually giving perhaps more direct access to end users and for businesses the opportunity to kind of do customer service or customer engagement and so on. Whereas at the moment, if you think about, potentially SEO not working the way that it has been at all. In fact, what do we even mean when we say SEO, or what do we even mean within a chatbot setting? If we think about content bundling or content ownership or authorship or even content moderation, generative AI in these sort of chatbot type environments are completely changing the sort of human AI interface or the human AI interface and how you even think about customer acquisition, customer engagement, building relationships. It's an entire reimagining, I guess, of relationship building between a business and a customer, or even between a customer customer and any kind of service fundamentally. And I think we still can't, I mean, we're still quite early in our understanding of even what's possible. I mean, we can sit here and talk about exciting areas and industries, and, and so on, but truly AI native products for all of those different industries that, that will be impacted are at a very nascent stage. I don't know that we've even started to kind of fully understand the scale of what's about to change. And I'm not saying that as someone who, is completely riding the hype, because obviously there's a lot of hype. I, in fact, do have some skepticism about what's possible today and how long it will take to sort of see all of these products through. But I'm certainly a buyer of this being a legitimate technology that's actually going to be quite transformative, even if it does take a little longer. And even if we do have to deal with some roadblocks along the way, I do worry about moderation. I do worry about hallucinations, unintended consequences and the like, right? So I'm excited about the scale of the opportunity, even though I actually do think it will take some time and there's a lot of problems to sort of solve until we get there.
Yeah, and even using your own framework, it does sound like it is more transformative than the shift to digital or social, just because it is affecting creation and distribution so comprehensively.
Yes.
And it's an exciting time, I think, for AI. Of course, media as an industry would probably be one of those that's most affected by the
Yes.
ability to generate content and shifts in the distribution of content. Obviously, there's a lot of hype. You mentioned that yourself. Which AI use case to you in media is most overrated, and which is flying under the radar?
Yes, there are some. I mean, I overrated, and this is sort of contradicting myself almost. I don't know if it's overrated, but I do think it's overused, and inevitably it's chatbots, right? And of course, the native chatbot interface is I think, going to become very, pervasive and mainstream. But equally, I don't think we should forget that, kind of more old-fashioned traditional interfaces can work just as well or even better in certain settings. And so I think, again, not that it's overrated, but it's definitely overused, and it's good to sort of not forget there are still other ways that work, and we should, keep in mind in terms of interfaces.
I agree. I think that chat is so powerful an interface with AI that it becomes what everyone is using and talking about, but we forget that there's reasons we moved away from chat in UI and user experience generally. And there's plenty of other ways to interact with products that are more helpful. So I'm looking forward to innovation in the space that isn't always entirely focused around a conversational interface.
Exactly. And that's not to say that obviously chatbots are not going to, take over many, many functions right now, but they shouldn't have, but not everything, basically. In terms of what's flying under the radar, I mean, I think there's a lot of very cool stuff happening in AI that's not about neural networks, which is potentially getting a little bit ignored. So there are, for instance, companies developing alternative AI architectures, for instance, based on Zetlin machines that are very innovative as relates to machine learning applications that are as performant or even more performant, that are using a fraction of the compute, that are achieving similar types of accuracies or efficiencies, and could be very interesting, for your kind of typical enterprise applications, but also analytics on device, or, doing kind of also all sorts of other things. So I think we shouldn't forget that AI actually does mean neural networks, but also like tons of other stuff. And I think those spaces are very, very, very interesting too.
Yeah, that resonates with all of the conversations I've had on this show, where AI practitioners are very quick to point out the number of techniques available to people building AI systems, and that neural nets feel like they're eating the world. But when it comes to actually architecting systems that do create value and work as expected, there are many other systems that you should be using in the place, or at least in tandem with neural nets. I mean, as you invest in this space, what's the number one thing that you think founders misunderstand about the appetite for AI among VCs?
Yeah, I mean, VCs are obviously very interested in AI, but what we're really looking for, when we meet a company and when we look at the product, is that the product is differentiated from other products and that it is defensible, right? And that it's using that differentiation in order to deliver better value for its customers, and that it's defensible so that it's future proof and kind of will continue to grow and have longevity. And historically, AI and obviously proprietary AI built within a startup has been associated with having that kind of differentiation and defensibility in-house. So historically, mentioning AI or talking about your AI has been a shortcut to communicating that you have these properties, that you're differentiated and defensible. But actually, I'm sure you've heard this before, these days, especially with generative AI, in fact, mentioning AI or generative AI could in reality oftentimes have the opposite effect, right? So today it's more often associated, or rather not necessarily with not being defensible, but generally the default is that it would probably raise a concern on that front. So it's almost flipped. And so my advice when pitching is that I don't think it's as powerful or as obvious what you mean when you just say AI. Rather, in the pitch, it's all about that differentiation, defensibility, and kind of communicating that and conveying that rather than just saying AI, as you might have done before.
Yeah, very good advice, and probably not so different than what you were looking for before the AI boom, right? Which is it differentiated and is it defensible? Probably the most important things for VCs.
Yeah.
What do you think? Obviously, AI is a key part of this, but you touched on this a little bit too. What is driving funding in this space right now, and what is the biggest roadblock?
I mean, it has to, I think we have to talk about generative AI, right? It's undeniably the sort of dominant type of product that's kind of attracting attention within VC circles and founder circles today. Yeah, we did mention it already. There's undeniably a bubble. It's undeniably very hyped. But, and I agree with this, I do think there's a genuine belief that the technology will actually be universally very impactful and very relevant, also within an enterprise setting that we know VCs like, and that inevitably great products will come out from the current activity and future activity. So it is receiving, with all of the concerns around it, and especially around defensibility and the like, that's all true. But nevertheless, it is obviously receiving the biggest attention at the moment. Other roadblocks, except for differentiation, defensibility concerns, the economics around investing in this space. So at the moment, valuations tend to be pretty high, especially at the very early stage for these types of products. So for many VCs, some rounds just don't make sense from a financial perspective. And the kind of second element of this isn't just sort of the current valuation for some early stage rounds, but also where you think that the valuation can grow to, right? So is the ability to grow or the sort of business model or the kind of product roadmap realistic and sustainable to feel confident that a company can justify a higher valuation at the next round and the next round and the next round to ultimately get some comfort around return on investment, right? And so if the initial economics don't make sense, ultimately it means that you're a bit concerned about the final economics. And so that can be a roadblock. I'm not quite sure what the solution is, but for the minute, it's definitely a question mark around some of these rounds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of hesitancy to go into the next rounds and the ability of founders today to build very flashy demos extremely quickly that maybe don't have the most solid foundations. Also, I think makes it hard to tell what's going on in this space. Shifting a tiny bit away and towards something that is maybe more personal to you that I've seen you've been doing. I've seen things you've posted on LinkedIn. I've watched you run a lot of women in AI breakfasts. What inspired you to start that, and what's the goal for those events?
Yeah, I mean, this is hugely important to me because diversity in tech has historically been, it's notoriously been challenging. And not only has there been a sort of lack of women in tech in general, but I think in AI in particular, it's probably even more exacerbated and even more so perhaps with generative AI. And so the objective of these breakfasts are to help build a network and, in fact, actually help foster an ecosystem where women can come together, but crucially, not to discuss diversity or challenges around diversity, but actually to discuss tech, right? So it's to talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning methodologies, to share advice on product building, to share advice about go-to-market or marketing tech products, to talk about their experiences as founders and what it means to be an entrepreneur in the AI space, about scaling AI products and so on. So it's a tech meetup. It's not a diversity meetup. It's a tech meetup, which I think is actually like a very, fundamental difference to some of the other initiatives. Not that there's not a lot of value to them, to be clear, but it's a tech meetup for being a tech and an AI founder. And so I hope that what it will do ultimately is help provide some support to women who are founders, and if a woman is not a founder already, that the ecosystem can in fact help you make that transition or make that decision to become a founder in the future. That's the mission, I guess.
I love that it's just, showing up and talking about the work and embodying that, because there's obviously so much incredible work being done in the space. And you're right, there is not enough. I mean, I see that even directly in this podcast, that when I look for chief AI officers at large Fortune 500 companies, so far, I haven't had a single woman on the show. That's not to say that they aren't out there, but they're definitely much fewer and far between. But there is a ton of innovation happening in this space. And of course, it's important to foster environments where you can do that, where it's really about the work and about the tech and about all of this incredible stuff that's going on. So I've loved watching you grow those breakfasts, and will continue to.
Thank you. And for anyone listening, please join us.
Yes, we'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to check those out. Moving maybe a little bit away from the market and towards, the buyers or you as a fund, what are your top priorities when you're investing in AI startups today?
Yeah, so there's a pretty standard, I guess, checklist in terms of the criteria, for lack of a better word. So first and foremost, it's looking at the team, right? The founders. So do they have sector expertise? Do they have a vision around what they're trying to achieve? But also looking at how they're planning on executing and sort of building out in practice, and also the leadership, right? Because obviously founders are very important, but really it's about hiring and bringing lots of very talented people together and building the right type of team and culture to grow the company. That's one aspect on the team. The other aspect is, can we work together? Mercury's strategy is very much to try and be part of the journey, and to try and add value, and to try and support and help however we can, right? And so that will vary depending on the company and what the needs are for each company. But we do really try to see this as a partnership, and it's a long-term one, right? So typically it takes 5 to 7 years is the sort of statistic to get to an exit. And so we obviously want to be able to work together. And so the team is very, very important. I mean, it's not remotely original for me to say that. It's the first and kind of the last thing in terms of early stage investing, right? And then beyond that, obviously it's looking at the business plan. So looking at the value proposition and seeing that there's real clients with real budgets, right? So at the end of the day, you need to be solving a problem for a real customer, and they need to be able to pay for it. So that's pretty basic, but not always true. So it's really kind of establishing that. It's looking at the market. So is it growing quickly? Is it possible to gain, some interesting market share? That includes also looking at the competition and looking at differentiation, defensibility, our favorite kind of phrases. Looking at the product, is it kind of robust? Can it scale? Looking at the technology there and the sophistication behind it. And then, of course, also looking at the buyer universe. People might forget about that, but ultimately, with your VC hat on, you're looking at the exit, right? And an IPO is great, but realistically, in practice, it's probably going to be in a position. And so it's really looking at the buyers and how varied they are, how numerous they are, how active they are, and what a sort of fit the company might have eventually within that landscape.
Yeah, I think particularly on that buyer side, in terms of having a clear exit strategy, or at least thinking about it from the very beginning. Is that something where you've seen a shift with AI at all? Or are you still, are you typically seeing, if it's vertical SaaS, are you seeing, like vertical buyers being the most likely acquisition targets? Do you go for more like strategic investors in terms of the biggest tech companies? Like, how do you think about that?
I don't think it's changed. It's changed very much. Maybe it's too soon in the market to call out any major shift. From our perspective, it hasn't changed because ultimately, either you're building an AI solution, in which case there's a tech universe where the AI solution can find a home, or it's a vertical solution, in which case it could be both, right? But if it's a vertical solution, you'll have your strategic acquirers, your competitors, for example. So there's, for the minute, no need to go away from the fundamentals in terms of what the exit route could look like.
Hmm. I guess you've touched on this a little bit just in terms of outlining how you invest, the things you look for, the things you avoid. It sounds very much business as usual to a large extent in terms of VC. Are there any ways in which you think investing in AI is different from traditional software? And if so, how is it different?
Yes, and we can't stress enough that the kind of typical business fundamentals and your sort of business as usual is very important, right? So, but those aside, for sure. I mean, there are a few kind of more particular considerations. You've alluded to these too. So, having solid engineering in place is critical. So, algorithms can be super exciting, but they have to work in the real world, right? They have to work at scale. They have to work within an enterprise setting. And so, actually, in many ways, it's often harder to have solid engineering and it's something that actually works when you deploy in place and ensuring that you hire for that in time and so on. So that's definitely one a critical consideration during due diligence. Another is really assessing whether kind of the company and what it does and the team can move fast enough to adopt new AI as it is released. So one of the interesting things about the sort of generative AI era is just the pace of new releases, right? Every month it almost feels like sometimes faster, obviously sometimes a bit slower, but there's just new generations or new versions of various AI tools that are kind of constantly coming out with new capabilities. And so you really have to make sure you're modular and that you're also set up to just be adopting and adapting as all of this stuff evolves. And that's, not obvious that it can always sort of happen easily within startup settings. So that's another consideration. And the third one I think is perhaps obvious, but no less important, which is data strategy. I mean, being an AI company fundamentally means you're a data company, right? And so I guess outside of being an AI company, data strategy isn't necessarily as important as within an AI setting. And so are you thinking about that from the get-go as fully as you should be, ensuring that you're kind of set up for success? Are you building a proprietary data set? You don't always have to, but if you are, are you kind of on the front foot about that? And really having a very comprehensive sort of thinking around data. So that's another kind of core consideration. I say these three are the ones that typically stand out because they're almost always considerations when it comes to AI products.
Yeah, it's funny seeing that on the flip side too, not from the founder side, but the buyers in enterprises. I think some AI founders are forgetting how much data needs to be in order if you're trying to plug into enterprise systems to deliver value. And you forget that
Yeah.
there's been a huge, like several decades of digital transformation going on, but there are still an incredible amount of legacy systems that these
Yeah.
AI founders are going to have a very hard time ingesting into their new products. So it's interesting to see how that's going to be dealt with over the next few years.
Yeah.
Do you think
Exactly.
that AI is changing how, not in terms of products, but is it changing how founders are building and growing their companies?
Again, in many ways, no, right? So obviously, all the kind of typical considerations are as true within an AI startup too. And in terms of what could be different, go to market and product, of course, could be a little different. Business model, I think, is worth highlighting because especially if you're using external APIs or if you're using human in the loop for quality assurance, for instance, because those spaces are evolving and the economics around those are evolving, you can very often end up having lots of hidden fees that end up breaking your unit economics and actually ultimately break the business model. And because this industry is still sort of evolving and we don't quite know what the economics is going to be precisely, or you don't know as your own product scales, exactly what your usage is going to be of those sort of third-party services. I think you have to be very careful and very thoughtful about the business model very early on, and ensure that you have that cushion and that margin to kind of adapt as those numbers might change. So that's definitely a difference within AI startups, especially if you're using third-party services, but also with quality assurance. Another area is recruitment. So it's ensuring that you have the right type of talent. AI engineers are not very common; they may be more expensive. So thinking about recruitment and having a plan around it, I think, is also very important. Recruitment oftentimes is what helps, rather what prevents a very fast scale. So it's a notoriously kind of challenging activity for startups. And so in particular, I guess, within this AI setting. And then a third is, ESG and responsible product design. I think I kind of alluded to that before, but being on the front foot around mitigating unintended consequences is also key. It's not something that you want to think about after the fact or when something's gone wrong. I think you just have to be very thoughtful about how you're building safely from the very beginning, and that obviously positions you very well afterwards for good scale.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I'd love to maybe peel the curtain back a little bit behind a recent funding round that you've been in. Can
Yeah.
you take us through that? What did it look like from start to finish?
So so I'll describe our typical process. So how it would apply to the last funding round too. So how it typically works is we have a first call with a person that you are initially in touch with at the fund. So that could be me or someone else from the team. And assuming that that goes well, and that there seems to be some fit at a very high level, we very quickly plan a follow-up call with actually the full investment team. And so that's to ensure that at a high level, with that preliminary information, there's sort of universal buy-in internally, and that everyone's on board with spending time and actually exploring an investment. So there's these two initial calls. Then, if there is alignment and agreement at a high level, that kind of kicks off the due diligence process, which it can vary depending on the product, but we will try and sort of contain it to around 2 to 3 weeks from end to end. And so that what that involves is spending time with the team, everyone on our side, or there's certainly not just the main contact, so that the team can know us, and us with not just the founders sometimes, but possibly some other folks too, but especially the founders. And then what we'll do is we'll closely look at all of the criteria that we discussed before. In practice, that means the financials, looking at commercial information, doing some homework on our side ourselves, some market research, for example, spending time understanding the product. And so that's both the technical details, but also using the product if we can. So if there's a working version or something that's available that we can get our hands on, it's always super exciting, actually, having, your kind of firsthand experience of the product. And that also helps you see what a partnership would look like. As I said before, we like to kind of support the growth and be part of the journey. So through that engagement, we get a bit of a flavor of what that would look like post-investment. And we also try to make it very collaborative. So we will kind of share with teams in advance what it is we're looking for and what our kind of key questions are, so that there's a lot of transparency around what we're solving for and what we're looking for, and they kind of have visibility in the process and sort of where we are through it. So as I said, that could take up to 3 weeks usually, and then assuming that goes well, we issue a term sheet and have our investment committee meeting, and after that there's the legal process. Again, how long that takes can vary. Typically, we try to keep it to up to 4 weeks. So looking at the transaction documents and closing the investment.
Nice. Thank you for that overview. I mean, it's nice. It's always nice to see everyone's process is similar, but they're all unique in their own ways. And so
Yeah.
hearing a little bit behind the scenes is helpful. Can you give some examples of the last time you decided not to invest in a startup, and what were the reasons?
So the last time was due to business model considerations. So it was a very interesting AI product, actually, that did have some initial traction, but we had some questions around how contract sizes could scale. And so therefore, what was the opportunity for sort of upselling, and ultimately it led to sort of market size questions. And so that was the reason not to invest ultimately. I'd say that that's not the most common reason, though. So other reasons that lead us to not investing more typically go back to competition and defensibility and differentiation, which is actually, it's probably the most common reason. Another common reason is not thinking that the exit potential is large enough to kind of justify the investment, because ultimately there's VC math that kind of has to make sense. And so a product could be really good, really cool, really different. But if it's, if the ability to sort of exit at a very high valuation isn't there, we don't have confidence around that, then that's a reason not to invest. And another relatively common reason, especially with generative AI, is ESG considerations and sort of questions around responsible product design.
Can you give a specific example around responsible product design where you might have decided, ooh, that doesn't quite fit with what we would hope?
Yeah. So, for example, if content is being scraped and the business model won't work if that content were to be licensed, and actually we would prefer that it was licensed from the beginning and not be scraped. So that's a concern, right? And so it's not only that, especially with our media heritage, it's not only that we think it's very important to license data. Inevitably, for compliance reasons, you'll have to do it. And so there's commercial reasons to have a solid business plan. That's pretty common, actually, right now with generative AI. A very different situation. You have a chatbot, you're engaging consumers. You have to be concerned about addiction. That's something that's actually not at all well understood, right? What's that engagement going to look like? How often? If you think about traditional success metrics and KPIs for startups, like time people spend on your product. Like, do they necessarily care for a chat? Do you want people endlessly speaking to a chatbot, for instance? Sometimes maybe that makes sense, but sometimes maybe it doesn't. So that would be another example, saying this in the within the generative AI world.
Yeah, it's great that you have that ESG lens because there's obviously plenty of investment going into this space. There's plenty of very, very large actors that are trampling all over many of those considerations and raising very big rounds. But it will be exciting to see how it comes out, and we'll see what happens. Looking forward a little bit, how do you think VC is going to be evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? Will it evolve? Is it going to be business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it is business as usual. There are some areas that are where I guess I'm seeing some innovation or some people thinking of things slightly differently within VC. One is looking at the VC model. So, typically VCs want to have a very large diversified portfolio, sort of limited engagement. I see some funds now that are just rethinking about capital allocations. So some might prefer a more concentrated portfolio, for example. Some may mix equity investing with lending. So it's just looking at that allocation strategy and seeing how much you can deviate away from the kind of typical VC model. Another area is definitely more, not that this will necessarily be the most mainstream, but more specialization by vertical. So more VCs that are looking to not be sector agnostic or generalist, but actually have a particular focus or a particular edge that gives them some kind of concentration. And actually a third area, which is becoming much more prominent these days, and don't necessarily, actually, I do think that it will continue to be the case in the next 5 years. I don't necessarily think it's a long-term change, but certainly a short-term, possibly medium-term change, is seeing more competition from VC, from other types of investors. And so that might be corporates that are becoming very active at the early stage, or more late-stage funds that would typically look at more mature investments of bigger companies that are further along on their journey, but they're actually now more active in the early stage. And so that is definitely changing the dynamics, I think, in our side of the world.
Yeah, I love that you touched on sector specialization in particular, because I think in AI, vertical specific solutions are going to be where a ton of value is created, because you can build on top of the biggest models. You can get better as the models get better, and partnering with a VC that has specialization in how you go to market within those verticals, I think becomes like a very strong strategic partner. So I'll be looking with curiosity as that evolves as well. You've touched on a couple things that concern you when you talk about ESG, but what does excite you and what concerns you when you think about the future of AI?
Yeah, I mean, look, concerning, of course, is the start from the negative is the ability to build responsibly. So, how can we ensure that we're privacy first, that we're AI safety first, and building responsibly in a way that's not just compliant but respectful of civil liberties, for example, of that's really kind of embracing the spirit of legislation. So, I am concerned about that. I do think that there's many people that care about this very much when they're building, but equally, there's many people for whom it's not necessarily a priority, and and that is obviously a space that's still evolving very much. But I am genuinely extremely excited about generative AI. I mean, it's very hard not to get excited about it. And related to that is agentic AI, of course, because you've mentioned this in this podcast, and I'm sure your audience knows as well. It's just so universally impactful, and it's just really exciting what's possible with it. And it's not only because of that native intuitive interface between humans and machines, and what that means for our interaction, and how we're going to use products and how we're going to start computers to do stuff for us, but also because it can just have such deep penetration in business, right? In an unprecedented way. So every facet of a business is potentially changeable because of generative AI. You can think about the entire ERP value chain, right? So how a business works, every department, but also how we work and collaborate. I touched on that before. So all of these areas should be looking at generative AI with a lot of curiosity, I think. And then on top of that, it's our ability to do analytics and have strategic decision making, data driven decision making, and have getting insights. So that entire industry as well is very much powered, could be powered rather, through generative AI. And so the impact could be unparalleled. I think there's huge opportunity to be had here.
I agree. I think it's one of those classic things in tech where people overestimate the short-term impact and underestimate the long-term impact.
Yeah.
When you see how profoundly excited VCs and people in tech are about what's going on, and then you look at what's going on in the real world outside of that tech bubble, people aren't as nearly as embracing the technology. I mean, there's fear around job displacement, of course, all of those things. But I think you're seeing a big gap starting to appear between those that truly understand how transformative this is going to be to software, and then those that have yet to really see like how this is impacting their daily life beyond asking GPT to write them a poem for their grandmother kind of thing, So it's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you see evolving AI regulations affecting VC?
I mean, inevitably, and I think in Europe in particular, there's a lot of awareness around this, and the impact of regulation, but also the importance of it. And I think there's a lot of mindfulness around it. I mean, my personal opinion is that, as with GDPR when it was introduced, regulation at the end of the day, I don't think will be a barrier. It's just another consideration when you're assessing growth, and what growth potential is, and kind of what the parameters for building are, whether in your home market or across markets. When you're building a company, you're not worried about tax legislation, or you're not worried about employment law. I mean, you're worried about them in the sense of knowing that they're there and that you need to be compliant, but they don't make you feel like you shouldn't be building or growing a company. So in the end, it was similar with GDPR, and in the end, I think it will be similar for AI regulation, right? It's just one other consideration, like the rest of them, that define the parameters for how you should be innovating. That said, it's a new space, right? So the law is still evolving. It's not properly really defined yet. There's some clumsiness around it. People have all sorts of views about existing legislation. Is it too heavy-handed? Does it really work? Is it auditable, and so on? But I don't think there's uncertainty around the spirit of the law, just like with kind of other legislation, and sort of what its intent is, and kind of what it's trying to solve for. So ultimately, I think if you're building responsibly and respectfully, and I mean respectful of your customers and your users, and of society and the environment, generally speaking, you should be fine, right? As the legislation evolves. And in fact, even being on the front foot about navigating regulatory frameworks, that might even give you a competitive advantage within Europe, at least, right, in the short term.
Yeah, I love that advice. If you're building responsibly and respectfully, you should be fine. Something that more people should probably take advice to heed as you're thinking about your next startup. So that leads us into our very quick lightning round. First episode of the pod where we're doing this, actually, but I'm going to trial it on you since you're a good friend and you're kind. What's the AI tool that you use the most?
I have to pick one. So Airtable, Notion, and ChatGPT, I'm not at all embarrassed to say, are my kind of go-to tools.
Okay, great. And is there a particular use case with Airtable that you're enjoying or that you use it a lot for?
It's with deal flow, and it's almost like a CRM for us, but it just helps with some of the analysis.
Okay, great. What about your go-to resource for staying up to date on AI?
That's newsletters. I personally use Substack, but I find, yeah, I have an array of newsletters that are really informative. Actually, I can name some if that's of interest. Not boring, Ben's Bites, AI Tidbits, AI Vibes, Strategy, not so much about AI, but I think very helpful in terms of considerations, market considerations. New Economies is a very good sort of VC newsletter that talks about some AI trends, one useful thing, and many others. I mean, I think it's newsletters, newsletters, newsletters.
That's great. That's very helpful. We'll put them in the show notes. Some of those are new to me. Stratechery is one that I find to be one of the most insightful kind of like structural analysis of what's going on in tech. And I am an avid reader of that one.
Nice.
Last question. What's a phrase or idea that recently stuck with you?
So something I keep coming across these days is the fact that enterprises don't yet know how to encourage generative AI adoption and innovation amongst their employees. And so we know people are using AI day to day, right? And they're trying ChatGPT and some of the other, or all of the other kind of generative AI products. And we know that there can be, and they possibly are already seeing lots of productivity gains for their work or with whatever they're doing. But there's a gap between kind of that productivity gains that they're seeing and any gain at the organizational level. So there's no impact yet in terms of organizational performance. And so there's a lot of thinking that says that actually that's because there's a complete misalignment of incentives. In fact, most enterprises are discouraging employees from using these tools. They're rightly concerned about privacy and confidentiality. And so there's a bit of a mismatch. And so I'm very intrigued to see how we kind of deal with that mismatch. You know, how can you realign, I guess, those incentives and get people openly using some of these tools and then seeing how they might end up kind of trickling back into proper productivity gains for the business. And there's actually a really good post by Ethan Mollick that's just about that. So I'd encourage, if this sounds interesting to people, I think it's a very good read, actually.
I think I've seen that post. I've seen some of the data, that came out as well. And it is very interesting because many people on this show have talked about change management being at the heart of getting any of the real rewards from AI and humans essentially being at the center of that. And right now, for all the reasons you just described, but also just the real human resistance that's going to happen as we start to try to push these technologies through, I think humans will have to be more open to it, and businesses are going to have to find a much better way, as you said, to align the incentives and actually manage this process.
Exactly.
Denise, that was all we have time for today. I could talk to you for hours, but I know that it's probably time to go. If our audience wants to follow your work and learn more about what you do, where should they go?
LinkedIn is the sort of main platform that I use, and I'm always open to connecting with, especially with founders, and always happy to look at pitch decks and give some feedback too. So very happy for people to reach out to me. And thank you for having me on. I'm a massive fan of your podcast, and yes, it's been really great being on, actually.
Yeah, you're too kind. I'm very happy to have you be our first VC on the show, and thank you so much for joining us. First of many.